Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you to the organizers for including our paper. And I really wanted to thank HEC for putting on this conference for the last 4 or 5 years. It's really important for the Canadian household finance community. So please keep doing this. This is really great. Okay, so this is a paper called Reducing Strategic Default in a Financial Crisis. Sumit, Slava, Sahil, Mandy, and myself. And before I start this, the views are not of the Philly Fed, the Federal Reserve System, the OSB, the Government of Canada, and anybody else. Okay, so what are we talking about today? 2009, in the middle of a big financial crisis. One of the key things that people are worrying about, that regulators are worrying about in a financial crisis, is negative externalities from debt. As we know, debt leads to more debt. People default, and there's a domino effect, and we have all kinds of externalities. So the big policy goal during financial crisis, both 2008 and 2020, during the initial parts of COVID, was to ease the financial stress of debtors, to make life easier, to try and get people not to default. So typically what happens in the middle of a crisis is the regulators, the government, is very nice and kind and gentle. What they do is they try and make your life easier. They give you a debt modification, they give you forbearances, they basically throw money at you to try and make your life better. Okay? And in other words, to increase financial resources to stop this domino of all the debts. What we're going to look at is the very opposite kind of government policy, which is to be hard and tough and brutal. And basically, in the middle of a crisis, 2009, say to these debtors who are in trouble, okay, if you guys default, we're going to punish you. We're going to hurt you. We're going to make it life difficult. And so the question we're going to ask is, does that work to actually know that the big threat, the big stick, rather than the kind and gentle and nice policy, which is usually the case? And bottom line, what we're going to find, what we're going to show, is actually this does work. If you're tough, and you raise the policy, and you raise the penalty, you raise the punishment, even in 2009, and I'm going to show you our setting, even for insolvent and bankrupt debtors, this actually significantly reduced the amount of debt. Sorry, the amount of default. And why is this the case? Because of this concept called strategic default. There's a huge literature on strategic default. There's many, many different definitions of strategic default. Sort of the simple definition that we're going to use in this paper is that a strategic defaulter is somebody who defaults on their debt in spite of having the ability to pay back the debt. Okay? So they could pay, but they default in any way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a pretty simple test of strategic default. And this is very similar to the methodology that Yannis uses in his student loan paper in 2020. And the idea is really simple. We have a long-term contract. In our case, let's say 5 years. Okay? And you start the contract a long time ago, and you're halfway through this debt repayment contract. Think of a mortgage. In our case, it's a bankruptcy contract. It doesn't matter. It's a long-term contract, but halfway through, not even halfway, partway through, something exogenous happens by the regulator. What does the regulator do? And we can explain the details in our setting. The regulator increases the penalty for default. Increases the cost of defaulting. Halfway through. Now you've already selected it a long time ago. Okay? And so what we're going to test, we have such a setting, which I'll explain in a few seconds. What we're going to test is, after this exogenous increase in the cost set by the regulator, does this reduce, of these guys who are partway through the five-year contract, does it reduce the default rate after this exogenous increase in the cost of default? And we followed Yannis, and this is sort of his argument. If there's actually a significant reduction in default after this exogenous change by the regulator, change in the penalty for default, the implication is, well, maybe these guys could have avoided defaulted before the penalty, because nothing else changes. Liquidity doesn't change, the contract doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the cost of default set by the regulator. So this is the simple test we're going to use. Follows Yannis. Why is default only going down after the government changes the cost of default? And the answer is, the assumption we're making, the argument we're making is, these guys could have avoided default in the pre-period, but didn't. which implies they're strategic defaulters. So that's the sort of setting of what we're going to do. That's the whole paper. I can sort of sit down now. The rest of the paper is just filling in the details of what we do. So very large literature, financial crisis policy, you know, but dozens of papers looking at what happened in 2008, some more recent ones, 2020, and vast majority of these papers look at policies where the government is nice and kind and gentle. They're supposed to help you. They're supposed to give you some money or forbearance or something. We do the opposite. Another big literature on strategic default in many kinds of settings. And one of the sort of takeaways from the strategic default literature is really, really hard to measure. Because number one, strategic default, which is basically, I'm a debtor. I could avoid default, but I don't. Okay? This is hard to see because people fundamentally want to hide this. You know, you don't want your creditor to know you're a strategic defaulter. So it's hard, the data is hard, and this is why this literature is really big. We have a very different methodology of trying to isolate strategic default using this exogenous change in the cost of default. We also tied to a bunch of other literatures. I'm going to explain to you, we're going to get deep into the weeds of Canadian bankruptcy law, so we tied to the Chapter 13 literature and also the BAPSIPA literature. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is 2009, Government of Canada changes what's known as the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. So many of you know the BAPSIPA literature, which is the American version of this. We're looking at the Canadian changes in these bankruptcy laws, and we can exploit this to sort of set our setting. Okay, before I carry on, just the last citation, which is the naked self-promotion, which we all have to do. So we have a companion paper by most of my co-authors, JFE forthcoming. So the setting which I'm going to explain to you is basically Canadian bankruptcy law. And as I explained, halfway through in our setting, the government changes the rules. It makes the default more expensive. This JFE paper, which is different from today's paper, doesn't look at what happens halfway through, but looks at what happens selection into this contract after the government changes the laws. So if you like, the other paper, the JFE, is about selection, and today's paper, it's the same setting, the same data, is about moral hazard and strategic default. So that's how we've separated these two papers. Okay, so the next couple of slides are sort of deep into the weeds of Canadian bankruptcy. It's sort of similar to US bankruptcy, but somewhat different in certain regards. So like the US, you know, US has Chapter 13 and Chapter 7. Canada has similar two kinds of bankruptcy. Our version of Chapter 13 is what Canadians call consumer proposal. And basically, this is a negotiation. And so where does the word proposal come from? Basically, the debtor proposes to the creditor, I would like a break. I would like lower payment over a longer period. Okay? And then negotiate, and only if the debtor and the creditor agree on this proposal, then it becomes a contract. And basically, this becomes a long-term 5-year or 3 or 4-year contract where the debtor has to, under the rules, has to pay, not under the rules, under what is being negotiated by the debtor and the creditor, this long payback period, 5 years typically, they have to pay, every month, have to pay back their creditor, and if they don't make 3 months payments, then by the law, Canadian bankruptcy law, this thing is now considered null and void. The contract is voided, and so these guys no longer have any bankruptcy protection. So, you know, as we all know, if you don't have bankruptcy protection, then your creditors can come after you, they can garnish your wages, they can send debt collection agencies. So what typically happens, not always, but most of the time, usually, if you default on your proposal, remember this is a 5-year contract, every month you're paying back a little bit of money to your creditor. If you default on this 5-year contract, then to defend yourself against the creditors who are going to try and garnish your wages, you file for consumer bankruptcy, which is the Canadian version of Chapter 7, which is what people were talking about in the previous paper. And this is quite similar to bankruptcy in the United States. You lose your house, there's a liquidation of your assets. But there's one thing that's sort of different, and that's going to be really important, and that's what we're going to base our whole paper about. Under the Canadian bankruptcy law, there's this thing called surplus income. Basically, this is net income, income minus expenses. Lots of definitions and lots of accountants trying to figure this out. But simple terms, income minus expenses, which is called in the Canadian bankruptcy context, surplus income. And what the rule says, and there's a change in this rule which we're going to exploit. But the simple version of this rule is, if your surplus income is positive, in other words, if you have some money, income after expenses, you have to pay 50% of this income for a certain number of months to your creditors. Okay? And this has been around for a long time. 2009, this rule changes. And this is the key exogenous variation that we're going to look at in our paper. This is the exogenous shock. What the government of Canada did, I don't know why, arbitrary, one of these typical arbitrary government policies that they imposed, they said, sorry, I'm pointing in the wrong direction. They said the number of months that you have to pay, remember 50% of your surplus income has to go to your creditor. In the old days, it used to be 9 months, and then in 2009, September, it became 21 months. Okay? So this is more than double of how much you have to pay to your creditors. Okay? In other words, this is the cost that you have to bear if you file for bankruptcy. Remember, going back a step, the first part of this slide, if you default on your proposal, then typically you file for bankruptcy. Now, 2009 happened, the government increased the cost of bankruptcy. So essentially, this is our whole paper. This is the identification in our paper. What this little episode has done, it's increased the cost, the implicit cost of defaulting on your proposal. Remember, this is the 5-year contract. Why? Because bankruptcy suddenly became much more expensive. Instead of paying your creditor for 9 months of your surplus income, 50%, you now have to pay for 21 months. So more than double. So this is the shock we're going to exploit to see, does this reduce default in amongst these proposable files. So a little bit more detail about these rules, and as somebody was saying in the earlier paper, this is typical government. There's all kinds of weird kinks and notches and weird stuff at arbitrary dates, which is really weird, but really great for economists to exploit, to find nice exogenous variation. So in simple terms, this is the picture we're going to look at. So first look at the blue line, which is the pre-reform. This is before 2009. And so on the horizontal axis, it's just surplus income. Remember, income minus expenses, more or less, some sort of formula. And remember, surplus income can be positive if income minus expenses is positive, but also if your expenses are big, then surplus income can be negative. Okay? And in fact, we have the data. I'll tell you about the data in a few seconds. But we basically, more or less, give or take, the average surplus income is about 0. So half the people have negative surplus income, which is not surprising because these guys are bankrupt. So these guys have lots of expenses and no income, so many of them on the left-hand side. The rule in Canada, which didn't change in the regulation in 2009, was that if you have negative surplus income, in other words, less than 0, you pay 0 to your creditors for 0 months. You give them nothing. Okay? If you have positive surplus income, and okay, the blue line, this is the old days, before the shock, the pre-reform period. In the old days, it was all 9 months. Okay? And that's why this blue line is upward sloping. And what it basically says is that as your surplus income increases, $200, $300, $500, $10,000, you're paying 50% of that times 9 months. Okay? So that's why it's a flat line. Then, here comes the red line. This is the policy shock that we can exploit, 2009. For reasons which are completely arbitrary, decided by some bureaucrat somewhere, they said at $200, which is an utterly arbitrary number, which had no relevance in the pre-period, all of a sudden, at $200, we are going to increase the number of months that you have to pay from 9 to 21. So that's why we have that notch at $200. So there's a kink at 0, but there's a notch at 200, and then the red line, it's a steeper line, because no matter what your surplus income, you're having to, you pay 21 months times 50% times whatever that number is. So we're going to exploit the notch at 200. This big jump, simply because you go from 9 months to 21 months. And so that's our treated group, the guys above 200. Our control group is the guys to the left of 200. Okay? Either from 200 to 0, or even from 0 down. And we're going to have various different ways of measuring that. So this is treatment and control, and the simple econometrics. It's a very simple diff and diff, basically. The simple diff and diff is the treated guys, all of a sudden, in other words, to the right of 200, more than 200, they have to pay a lot more. Okay? The control guys, to the left, nothing changes. Most of them, in fact, are paying 0 before and after. But the treated guys have to pay a lot more, and so the question we're going to ask is, okay, how does this impact the default rate of these guys? The default rate in this 5-year contract, this proposal contract, which means every month you've got to pay back your creditors, whatever you negotiated a long time ago. So that's the difference. It's remarkably simple. This is what I just said. So I really like this sort of natural experiment. It does a bunch of really nice things which really helps us in identification. So you can sort of see this little picture, this sort of timeline, the start and the end, and which is the beginning of the 5-year contract and the end of the 5-year contract. And these started, you know, any kind of day from about 2006 to the date of our shock, which is September 2009. We don't care when it started. All we care is that you are in the middle of your long-term contract when the shock happens. Okay? So we have no problem with selection, because the selection into the contract happened a long time ago. You know, 2006, 2007, whereas the shock is 2009 in the middle of the contract. So there's no self-selection going on here. We have a lot of evidence in the paper. We've been trying to persuade you there were no other confounding policy changes at exactly this moment, which is September 2009. Now, this is in the middle of the financial crisis, so I'm going to show you all kinds of robustness tests about the financial crisis, but nothing else happened in policy on this exact date. And the key thing about this contract, about this policy shock, nothing changes to the balance sheet or the income statement of the creditors, of the debtors because of this policy. Remember, these are proposal filers. They negotiated a long time ago. Their income doesn't change, their liquidity doesn't change, their balance sheet doesn't change, nothing changes. The only thing that changes is something affecting something else, which is the bankruptcy laws, which implies that if you default, you don't have to, but if you default, the costs go up. Because if you default, you're going to file for bankruptcy, and if you're going to file for bankruptcy, and if your surplus income is above 200, then you've got to pay for 21 months and not 200, and not 12 months. So we think this is a very nice setting. It solves a lot of problems, the usual problems we have about selection. Okay, so that's basically the identification that we're looking at. Data, and this is another nice, we think, part of this paper. We use data from the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, which is the Canadian bankruptcy regulator. And the Americans in the room, the one big difference about Canadian bankruptcy and American bankruptcy in the United States, there's 94 different court districts in the US. Everyone has their own bankruptcy judges. Everyone has their own bankruptcy data. It's pretty complicated. People doing bankruptcy in the United States have to deal with lots of different jurisdictions. Our setting in Canada is much simpler. There's one office, federal office in Ottawa, OSB, Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, and so there's only one people who provide the data, and they have provided us in this paper with the universe of bankruptcy and proposal filers. And because they're regulators, they regulate this debt contract with incredibly deep data. So at the beginning of the contract, which is when the negotiations happen between the debtor and the creditor, I can see all kinds of things about the type of filing, the date of the filing, is it joint and single, husband and wife, the different reasons for filing. I can see all kinds of the debt characteristics of how much do you pay back? Do you pay back every 2 weeks, every month? I can see all of that. I can see exactly how much you pay back, when you pay back. I know everything there is to know, not everything, but I know a huge amount about the debtor on the date of the bankruptcy filing. I have no time series, but on one day, the day of the filing, I can see pretty much everything. And it's very rich in household finance. I can see the full balance sheet and the full income statement. And then, most importantly for this paper, we can see the performance of this debt through time. Every month I can see, did the guy pay or did he default? And I can see the exact day if and when he defaulted. So, just a quick summary stats. Just to highlight, just to give you a flavor of the magnitudes here. The sort of red square in the middle, total unsecured debt, 32,000 Canadian dollars. This is how much is negotiated by the debtor, sits down with the creditors, and they're arguing about this $32,000. And the bottom square at the bottom, 0.41, basically the result of this negotiation, of this proposal, is about 41 cents on the dollar. You owe the guy 100, and you end up negotiating that you only pay 41, and you typically pay it over a longer period. So this is a good deal if you're in proposal. And we're going to show you that these guys still default out of this deal. What else can we see? We can see, who defaults? And this is, again, these are bankrupt guys. Very high levels of default, far higher levels of default that you see in the mortgage contract. 24% of these guys default, and another fraction, sort of 3%, that I've also highlighted, is an amendment, which is sort of a change in the rules that both sides agree to, and then they default. So it's about 27, 28% default rate, which is very high. And these are the guys we're looking at. These are the defaulters. And the bottom table basically is the days. We can count days, precise dates from every event to every other event. So the typical time to default, not the typical, the mean, is 561 days, which is sort of halfway through this contract. What we're going to run is Cox models, proportional hazard models, which is sort of pretty standard in this kind of thing. These are all duration models, so everything is measured in days, from the day of the beginning to the day of the end, or the day of the default, which happens in the middle, if it happens. Okay, so we have both left censoring and right censoring. People can start before data. Also the end date is variable. I mean, this is also negotiated. You can most of the end dates are about 5 years, and you can see the spike at about 1,800 days. Some of them are 4 years, some of them are 3 years, and then that's sort of not many smaller than that. But this is negotiated between the debtors and the creditors. So because this varies, this fits nicely into a Cox model. The other nice thing about the Cox model is that the underlying distribution, and many papers have documented this, over time, this is unconditional. This has nothing to do with our event, our shop. This is the whole data. Basically what you see is a nice hump, not nice, but the default rate based on the age of the contract is sort of a hump shape with a big spike at about 1 year, when there's the most defaults. And then slowly over time, this thing goes downward till right near the very end of your contract. If you 1 week left to go with your contract, and 1 week later you're free, okay, and you get all the advantages of being free, the default rate that during that last week is almost zero. Nobody's going to default if they've got 1 more week to go. And there's also survivorship bias, the good types and bad types. The argument could be that the bad types have already defaulted in the earlier period. So we're going to exploit this. So number one, this goes in the Cox model. This is the sort of the basis of the Cox model, is this kind of picture. And then we're also going to exploit it in other ways. So here's our diff and diff Cox model, remarkably simple. Many control variables, many fixed effects, which you can read. And this is the headline result. The bottom left, where it says treatment times post, 0.85. And if you've done Cox, basically the coefficient that you care about is 1 minus this coefficient. So 1 minus 0.85 is 14%, and very highly significant. So this is the main heading of this paper is that there's a 14% reduction in default of these treated guys, who are the guys who have to pay the higher penalty, compared to the control guys, who are the guys who don't have to pay a higher penalty. Okay. And then we do a bunch of robustness. Here's a picture of the identical results. This is sort of a typical Cox picture. You can see the different curves. This is the survival picture. So if you survive, you don't default. And what we show, sort of the green line, is the post times treated. So the guys after the shock who were treated, in other words, who were above $200, the green line you can see is much higher than all the other lines. In other words, they survive longer, they don't default. So this is just a graphical version. So let's now look at some identification things. As you all know, with using a Cox, it's really hard to look at pre-trends. Everybody cares about pre-trends and sort of a diff. So we just for the purposes of pre-trends, we do a very simple linear probability model. So just to show you that this is completely raw data. You know, not adjusted for anything. Pre and post, our control is blue and our treated is red. And you can see sort of there's high volatility. Remember, this is 2009. There's all kinds of stuff going on, okay? But if you take this picture and you add fixed effects and you put all the controls, basically you have a very nice linear probability model that looks like this, which sort of says no pretrends. We don't have to worry about pretrends, which is sort of nice. And just more identification, I'm going to leave this on this. Oh, just one more. The notion was this number at 200 was completely arbitrary and was only introduced in 2009. So the number of $200 should have no impact in the pre-period before 2009. And we run a Catenary test, and there's, as we predicted, there's 200 it means nothing, the level of the $200 in the period before 2009. Okay, so that's sort of the heading of the main takeaway of the paper. Then we do a bunch of mechanisms, and so we now get to sort of digging into what's going on here, what's causing all this stuff. And one of the first things that our data can show us that is quite interesting, and especially in the context of strategic default, is the notion of how much, number one, do you own a house? And number two, how much equity do you have in the house? Now remember, our bankruptcy data, our proposal data, we can see at the date of the filing, we can see the exact amount of the mortgage. And also what's quite interesting and quite unique in our setting, because the bankruptcy is filed by this guy called the trustee, who's an accountant, who's regulated by the regulator, blah, blah, blah. Part of this guy's job is to find out the best estimate of what the current value of the house is as of the date of the filing, which is sort of quite unusual. Typically, when you're looking at when you're looking at house prices, you know, it's hard to find the value of the house at that exact date. You look at the area or other things, it has all kinds of indoctrinating problems. So we have a really good measure of both the mortgage and the value of the house, the market value of the house at that exact date. One minus the other is sort of equity in the house. Why do we care about houses? I mean, this is a large literature on the role of equity in strategic default. This is not our argument, but many people have made the argument and have said basically, if you have low equity in the house, and you then default, in other words, you walk away, because the guys who have low equity are more likely to walk away compared to the guys who have high equity, that's an indication of strategic default, because equity should have no impact on whether you default or not. But as we know, in 2009, they had this idea that many people were deep underwater, so they walked away from the loan, and many people argued that this was strategic default. We are now examining this whole house thing in a very different setting, because our main shock is the policy shock, okay, which has nothing to do with equity. But what we're going to do now is we're simply going to do cuts of the guys with the house, and we can see this perfectly, and the guys no house, and also the guys with equity, positive equity, or with zero or negative equity. And the argument is, essentially what we're doing here, is we have two kinds of strategic default happening at the same time. The first kind of strategic default, or the first mechanism, is our main story, which is the government changed the rules and made things more expensive. Now we interact that with the second kind, which is how much equity we have in the house, or firstly, actually, do we have a house or not? And as the result shows, if you have a house, you really, really don't want to default, because you're going to lose your house if you go bankrupt, okay? Combined with, if you have a house, combined with the change in the policy, for those guys, which is column number 1, there's a very large reduction in the default rate. Okay, for 2 reasons. You don't want to lose your house, and the price of the default has gone up. Okay? On the other hand, so 0.75, pre times post. The no house guys, just like cut, which is about 2/3 of the group, the treat times post coefficient is much higher, 0.89, almost 0.9. Okay? So this is consistent with the literature that says if you have a house or if you have high equity in the house and you don't want to lose the house, this adds to your motivation to act strategically. And you don't want to lose it. However, if you have no house or if you have negative equity, then you're happy to walk away. Then that is less binding on you. Okay, so that was the first thing, the first cut we looked at. The second cut is adverse events. And for those of you who know the literature, there's a big discussion on this notion of adverse shocks, adverse events as a cause of default. This is marriage, sorry, not marriage. Marriage is not adverse. It's usually divorce, death, lose your job, health shock, those kind of shocks. Okay? And the big issue in the literature, that was a slip. The big issue in the literature is how do you measure these things? It's really hard to measure these shocks and tie these measurements to this kind of data kind of database. What's really nice in our bankruptcy setting is we can exploit a simple question that was asked of every bankruptcy filer on the day they file, and the question is, give reasons for your financial distress. And they have to write words. It's not tick the boxes. And so what we did is we coded these things and we categorized them using an algorithm, and we then categorize these things into different of the big reasons. So losing your job, loss of income, health, business failure, and another one. So all of these guys, we can see this. Okay. So the argument here is that if you have an adverse event, if something bad happens to you, then you're less likely to be strategic. Okay? Because then you really are liquidity constrained. That's why you're defaulting. Okay? So the argument is, if you have an adverse event, because it's less likely to have a strategic default, this number that we estimate on column number 1, 0.90, is higher, which is exactly as predicted. Okay? If there's no adverse events, in other words, you have no liquidity shock, no liquidity strain, life is fine, life is great. And then we have the shock to the policy shock of 2009. What you can see is that's almost 10 percentage points larger, 0.8. Okay? So 1 minus, that's 20%. So those guys with no adverse events, no death or divorce or things like that, are far more likely to act strategically after this policy shock. And we do various other cuts. I'll show you, talk about this one. So remember I showed you this graph. This is about, just to repeat, this is the picture of the age of the loan contract. Remember, 5 years, give or take, starts a long time ago. And what I showed you was, and this is, many people have showed this, is that as you're getting towards the end of your contract, you're less and less likely to default. Why? Because you're close to the end, when all the good stuff happens. So what we then say is, does the age of the contract, is it young or is it old, is it 5 years old or is it 1 year old, impact the probability of strategic default? And the answer is, as we will predict, if you are very young, in other words, the way we described it here, is if your contract was in 2008 and or 2009, those, which is a young contract, remember the event is September 2009, those guys have a very large reduction in strategic default because, going back, the young guys, which is sort of where the hump is, there's lots of space for these guys to start defaulting. Whereas the old guys, very close to the end, they're almost at zero already. There's very little room for more default to happen. So we documented, based on this picture, that actually the age does matter, as predicted, in terms of who's defaulting. Then we have a whole variety of robustness checks. We do different windows. Again, so this is the middle of the crisis, 2009. All kinds of weird, crazy stuff is happening. Maybe the crisis is causing this. So we look at really short windows, just 3 months before, 3 months after, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. And the effects hold. In other words, even within the 3 months before, 3 months after window, our effects still hold. So it's not really driven by these big macro shocks causing the crisis. We do pseudo event dates, September's and other years, no effect. We do a whole bunch of other robustness checks. Here's the conclusion, and then I'm going to have one more slide, future work after this. The conclusion, basically, we provide evidence which is quite contrary to much of the literature. And the evidence says punishing, the threat of hurting somebody, the threat of punishment will actually, even in a crisis, and even for people who are insolvent, these are all bankrupt guys, will actually serve to reduce default, okay, which is the exact opposite of the typical policy, which is to be nice and kind and gentle and give people more money and more lower interest and more forbearance, etc. So we think this is it's quite unusual. It's a very unusual setting, and we think this is quite an unusual finding given the literature. Okay, last, I have 2 minutes left. Future research. And this ties to the discussion that people were having in this room about linking to labor markets. Because we are very interested in our setting. These guys have reduced default. They're all insolvent. Where did they get the money from? How could they reduce default? Where did it come from? And the way we're going to try and answer this is to link our data, which is Government of Canada bankruptcy data, to Government of Canada tax data. And some of you, many of you in this room are dealing with Government of Canada tax data. It's hard, it's complicated, it's messy. And this basically took us many, many years to actually match the data with the Government of Canada. The problem is bankruptcy data, the name and address is public. It's a court case. So you can see the name and address of every bankruptcy filer, and of course the tax guys don't want names and addresses near anything. So after much negotiation, we managed to persuade them to anonymize this. So we currently have the data, so we can see for every one of these guys in our treatment group and our control group, we can track their tax filings for many years before and many years after. So we can look at anything we can see in tax filings to try and figure out where did the money come from. We have preliminary findings, which is that what we are finding is for the treated guys, the guys who are trying to avoid default because it's very expensive, what happens to those guys is there's an increase in the number of jobs. Typically from 0 jobs, unemployed, to 1 job. This is the number of T4 forms for the Canadians in the room. Okay, we're going to see that quite significantly. So these guys are working more jobs to avoid the costly default. Right now, where it stands, we are looking for advice from you guys as to what else we could look at in the tax data. You know, we're thinking of things like self-employment, the RSP or the savings drawdown. I heard some really cool discussion about, you know, education. Maybe we can look at that in tax filers from the previous paper. Looking at, you know, marriage or having kids. We can see all of those things. So all of those things are part of our future research to try and answer the question, where did the money come from for these treated guys to avoid default? Thank you.
Hey everybody, thank you so much, Barry, for giving me a chance to talk about this paper. I'm actually a little bit frustrated with you because you made my job very hard. So normally when you give these discussions, what you're really hoping for is the paper is wrong, because then it's very easy. You're just like, the paper is wrong because of X, and your job is very simple. But if you can't do that, then you're hoping that the paper is unclear, and then you can just restate the paper, but cogently. And again, I feel frustrated with Barry because he had the audacity to cogently describe what he was doing, and therefore repeating what he just said won't be very helpful. So I then have to think, which is making my job as a discussant more difficult. So that's what I'm going to do. So you know, we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I'm going to provide just maybe an alternative framing for the same idea. Yeah, well, I'll talk about maybe how I'm reconceptualizing this paper. Okay, so we vary the penalty for default, but we don't vary the current environment because the penalty is out in the future, and so it doesn't affect anything about our current liquidity. And then we want to see what happens here, and we see that the default hazard drops, right? And in particular, one of the, I think it was buried in mechanism 2, but one I want to just focus in on is it seems to be concentrated among those folks who look less distressed, like they're employed, for example. Okay, so what I want to do is come back to a different literature that Barry didn't talk about very much, but kind of think about how we might understand this paper in light of that, and that is the optimal default penalty literature. So does the higher default penalty deter default? Yes. But for whom does it deter default? It looks like it's those with less distress or without distress, and I want to understand what that means. Okay, so where does this literature sort of come from? So it says, imagine that you got debt, right? So debt is a contract with the same payoff in the good state and the bad state. You owe the same amount, without default, you owe the same amount in the good state and the bad state. But imagine a world where in a good state and a bad state, for example, you're unemployed or you're employed, your earnings are different in those two times. Now, you would like an insurance contract where you pay the money when you're employed and you get money when you're unemployed, transferring wealth from the employed good state to the unemployed bad state. That would be an ideal contract, but with moral hazard, adverse selection, that's a contract that often doesn't exist. Now, the key thing to note is that what you'd really like, maybe, then for a debt contract, like a mortgage or something, is you'd like it to have default, but only in the unemployed state. Maybe in the employed state you pay, but in the unemployed state you don't pay. And that's nice because it frees up the money that you would use on your mortgage for the cash that you need because you're otherwise unemployed. So what I'm trying to say here is that this literature argues that defaulting on your mortgage in the bad state, but not the good state, creates an insurance. Because you pay the mortgage in the good state, you don't pay it in the bad state, you free up money in the bad state. In equilibrium, there's a higher interest rate because there's going to be default, and so effectively you're paying for this insurance coverage in the form of a higher interest rate. So basically, default in the bad state is providing you with insurance, and that's a good thing. Okay, so what do we do with that in the context of a default penalty? Well, imagine I make the default penalty 0. Then you're like, hey, I'd love to default. And I'd love to default in the good state, and I'd love to default in the bad state, and I default all the time, and there's no insurance, because there's no differential outcome, right? Also imagine that the default penalty is, I'm going to shoot you and your family and everyone you've ever talked to, except your enemy, and I'm going to give them a lot of money, right? That's the penalty. Well, now you never default. You don't default in the good state, and you don't default in the bad state. So again, we don't have insurance. What you're looking for is a Goldilocks level of penalty that is just big enough that you want to default in the bad state, but you don't want to default in the good state, right? So if we think that's sort of what an optimal default penalty looks like. So if I tell you, or if Barry tells you, we have introduced a higher default penalty and it prevented people from defaulting, Barry's calling that strategic per se because they had the money. But if I put a gun to your head and say, if you don't give me the money, I will shoot you, and you come up with the money, were you being strategic? Like maybe, or maybe you just cut way back on your consumption to a desperate level, or maybe you borrowed it from somebody at an outrageous interest rate, or maybe you did something that involved a lot of suffering, but it was just because Barry put an infinite penalty on you, right? So he wants to call as strategic any increasing penalty that works, but I would argue that there's just a little higher hurdle, which is who is it inducing, who on the margin is being induced to default? Is it a guy who looks like he can afford it, and then it looks strategic, or is it a guy who looks like he can't afford it, in which case you could call that strategic if you want, but I would argue that that's a problem. And what's cool here is I think Barry actually in this paper has the data to differentiate that. He shows the thing he needs to show, which is like, it's like on the margins the employed guys. So I think we've met the criteria that I would want him to meet, like he's already done it. So we're just talking about framing, not an actual problem with the paper. All right, so just to sort of break that out, we have no default penalty, everyone defaults. We add a moderate default penalty. That induces the employed to default, increasing insurance. Then we add a more severe penalty, that's called breaking kneecaps. That induces even the unemployed to default, but we don't like that. It's too severe, okay? So a couple things to note here. We're talking about Canadians, they're very nice. There'd be no broken kneecaps. And so, you know, I think we're not saying that we're in this kneecap zone, but we want to test that, and I think we do. The other thing that's really interesting about this intervention is this framing of just like, let's ramp up the penalty and see who's induced to default, misses the nuance that there are different ways you can ramp up the penalty, and the ramping up that Barry talks about is really interesting specifically targeted to people most able to afford it. In other words, it's designed, I think, to induce the employed to be impacted but not be unemployed. And the reason is, it's charging you out of future net income. And so if you aren't going to have any future net income, in other words, you're really in distress, it doesn't affect you. But if you are expecting to have a lot of future net income, in other words, you're less in distress, it's going to affect you more. So in some sense, what this is the penalty is, I'm going to break your kneecaps, but only if you drive a luxury car. Right? Like, that's only going to target people who drive luxury cars, and therefore it's going to be effective in flipping the people who you think are most strategic. So in some sense, it's not just like a general penalty. It's an excessive penalty at the top end and not the bottom end, which is exactly what you want to reduce bad default, but allow good default. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to say is, like, we can quibble about this, but to my eye, increasing the payment out of net from 9 months to 21 months, it doesn't feel like a giant change. It feels like a change, but like we could call it a marginal change, I guess is what I want to say. What that means, if we're calling this a marginal change, is that we're seeing the people who are flipped on the margin, which is these are people who are kind of indifferent about defaulting. And so what's really cool is you can compare, you can see who on the margin is indifferent, as I kind of think what Barry's estimating here, and compare that to what the rest of the distribution looks like. And we're seeing these guys are better off. Now, if you wanted to, you could then build a structural model, and you could say, well, I think the marginal utility of these guys is this much higher because they're unemployed, and then we can say something about, you know, what the dollar cost is of the harm for this group, and therefore what the implicit dollar harm that these incremental guys attribute to this penalty. Again, that's really then about Barry's next step, which is like you have the data to identify what the marginal utility is of these people who are being induced on the margin to a default. Okay, so the other thing to say is about external validity, which is like noting that we induce these guys to stop defaulting and noting that they're not particularly in distress means that the Canadian system at this time was too lax. Now, in the context of Canada at other times, that probably means that in good times it was really, really too lax because this was during a financial crisis. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, if you did this in some other context, it would be a good idea, because in the US, for example, I think a lot of people think we don't have we can argue. Many people don't think we have a particularly lax system in the US, so just because we are inducing folks who can afford to pay in Canada by increasing the penalty doesn't mean that would be true in some other country. But it probably does generalize to other times in Canada, because I can't think of a time with more distress than this one for Canadians. Okay, so great job, I loved it. I would frame it in this context of like who's defaulting, but you can because you have all that results. And thanks for your good work.
Thank you, Stephen. Really great comments. Yeah, I didn't know this literature. This is great, the optimal default literature. Thank you. This is a new introduction. You don't like the word strategic. I completely agree with you. I hate that word. But we use that word because the literature uses the word strategic default. I don't know what it means. Everybody uses it differently. I wish we could have a different word. Basically, people who default, even in spite of being able not to default. Your other stuff about the structure model, absolutely, I agree with you. We're looking at the marginal guys. So really fantastic comments, Stephen, and you and I can talk more about wonderful comments. And we're going to probably do all of these things. Open to other, yeah.
So I want to start saying I absolutely believe your results, but it's really weird to do a pre-trends test in a linear world, because if the trends are parallel when you're in linear, they're explicitly not parallel when you move to like a non-linear world, right?
Okay, why we did this? Because referees and discussants screamed at us and they said we need pre-trends.
Yeah.
So this is not part of the main story. This is not a Cox model. This is a weird, why are we doing an LPA model? Because you can't do pre-trends in a Cox model. So if you have advice on how to do this better, we would be very open to this. It's just, this is an answer to referees saying, what are your pre-trends? So that's why we did this.
Okay.
But I take your point, the linear versus non-linear. That's really important. But I don't know how to do pre-trends in a Cox model. That's my problem.
I guess it would just be the marginal effects. I mean, you can do a linear version of a Cox model.
Yeah, we did.
But
this is sort of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, in fact, this is exactly that.
but yeah, in response reference makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
I was wondering, given the very acute threshold of $200, right? Why not also try to do a regression discontinuity design?
Oh, we did. That's our other paper. That's the JV paper. That's all about. That's a big RDD, but that's the selection into the new guys coming in. Remember, our guys are halfway through, but the JFE paper is what we found actually was this huge amount of, not huge, but significant bunching just below the 200 for the new guys coming in. In other words, some shady manipulative stuff is happening to get their surplus income just below 200. That's JFE. So we did the RDD a lot. Could we do RDD here? Sure, we could.
Yeah.
We would have to think about it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah.
So since you brought up other accounts, I think it's also related to the other presentation earlier that in Canada, actually our RSP is protected from bankruptcy. They cannot take your money away. So maybe there's some strategic decision there. I want to protect my RSP. I don't want to withdraw due to financial hardship. But now you increase the penalty for bankruptcy. No, I don't want to live with frozen pizza for the next 5 years, so I would start taking more from RSP.
Well, we haven't done the test yet, but that's precisely what next week we're going to do. We can see the RSP data. RSP is sort of Canadian retirement savings plans. We can see that data, and we're going to test for the treatment controls, and we're going to test we don't know, are they going to save their RSPs, as you think, or are they going to actually draw down the RSPs in order to avoid this costly default? That's a good question. I'll tell you in a week. Between now and lunchtime. Yeah. Thank you.
Tell me more about how marital stability is a negative. I was more on point. Is there a sense in which the differences between employed and unemployed sort of a feedback? I'm not entirely sure how to think about it, but there's this idea of if you go bankrupt, it is really bad for your labor market outcomes. Whereas you maybe have a proposal. Is not that? It's a question.
That's a good question. Is it bad to go bankrupt for your labor market outcomes? Because, sorry to interrupt you, Nate, but remember, bankruptcy protects you from your creditors. So the previous paper was all about, we don't want to work because the creditors are going to steal our money. But under bankruptcy is a lovely thing. Because it keeps the creditors away.
In the sense of that there's more hiring on credit scores, where firms look at how creditworthy are you, and is it the case that if you in that world go bankrupt, that nobody really wants to hire you?
That's a very good point. And basically, we can run the test comparing your hypothesis is because of the credit score, you'd be less likely to get hired. So in other words, a supply effect. Our story is a demand for job effect. We want to work harder. We want to make more to pay for this penalty. Our data can do the net effects of those two things. So that's a really great point. And we can net those two things out. Thank you for that. That's very good. I didn't think about that. Yeah.
If your 7 hinges on the latent knowledge of there's going to be a greater penalty and I will default, I think you could maybe exploit how you only use people that already have an agreement for what is the percentage of the agreement that I've been exposed to that higher latent knowledge. So it's way different if I leave T-1 months without the higher penalty for default in 1 month.
So
rather than the reverse.
In a sense, the Cox, I'm not sure, but I think what the Cox models are really doing is exactly that. Because the Cox thing is the days to an event, okay? And so if you're under this new thing, and how the Cox works in the diff is that the Cox in the diff actually has 2 periods for each individual. So the sample size is double. Why is that? Because you have a pre-period and then pre-shock period and a post-shock period for each individual. So in other words, we separately estimate the coefficients for the same guy, Barry in the pre and Barry in the post. He gets 2 different coefficients. So I think that's these 2 different coefficients in the post. Are you there for 5 days or 5 years? And that's captured in the shape of the Cox model. So I'm not sure, I'm not able to think fast enough, but I think we capture that already.
Awesome. Okay, so we have lunch provided outside. Thank you, Barry. We have